thank you first of all for making yourself available for this conversation. It's
Thank
great
you
to
very
have
much
you here.
for inviting me. I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to it.
Great. So, Professor Moeller, for the people at home that are not acquainted with you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? What do you do? What's your area of expertise? Where you're teaching and all that?
Yeah, I teach philosophy at the University of Macau. And one of the reasons why I'm here in Macau is that my background is Chinese philosophy and Chinese studies when I was young. But I'm also interested in contemporary social theory, particularly the German social theorist Niklas Luhmann. So I wrote a few books on him and on Taoist philosophy. And since a few years, I'm basically trying to use these ideas that I found in Taoism and in contemporary social theory and to apply them for analysis of contemporary society of the world we live in, and especially regarding questions of identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I saw some videos on your channel. As I was saying earlier, I'm a subscriber of your channel, and I think you have plenty of interesting ideas ranging from social media, from politics, from the role and purpose of art, wokeism, a lot of contemporary topics. And I think that for the people that are not acquainted with you, I think they should check your channel because it's got some very, very interesting content in there. And especially because I think that you're very clear in the way that you expose these issues, in the way that you discuss these issues. You have a very sympathetic way of talking and way of putting these things out there on your videos. And personally, I learned a lot from it. I'm kind of not a skeptic, but I'm not too much of a fan of social media. And on your videos concerning Prof Felicity, I found some things that were somehow occurring in my head, but I couldn't put it into words. And you put it in there so beautifully, so very
Thank
clear.
You very much. You're too kind. I'm glad you like the channel. Find it helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Viewers should check it out if you haven't already. So tell us a little bit about your relationship with cinema. How long have you been watching movies? What kind of movies do you like? Things like that.
Well, I guess as most people, I've been watching movies since my childhood, which is quite a long time ago, unfortunately. And I also, I like movies. I have probably very kind of old-fashioned taste, very similar to yours. I like basically all the directors and the movies that are on your video channel. Well, I don't know all of the movies, but I know most of the directors. So and so the general, I would say very similar, seems to be our taste in movies seems to be very similar. Yeah, was that the question? Anything else?
Yes, of course. I was thinking as well, if you have a particular preference for a type of movie, let's say they're drama or adventure or horror, I don't know.
Well, I like these kind of, as I said, the art movies, but when it comes to entertainment movies, I like mystery thrillers.
Yeah, me too.
That's also a German thing, I guess, from my television watching habits. I think that's one of the few. I don't like German cinema, and I don't like German music. Many things about Germany I don't like, even though I'm. But one of the things I grew up with were these German television, old-fashioned, right, 1970s kind of TV mystery, crime mystery shows, and that got me kind of, how to say, used to this kind of movie. So I still like to watch this kind of movies when I'm not watching artistic movies.
Yes, I think we all have, at least for me, speaking for me, I really enjoy, let's call it art films, but I also enjoy commercial films. Every once in a while, I watch a lot of films with my girlfriend, for example, and my taste in terms of filmmaking isn't exactly the same as hers, but I enjoy watching these films every once in a while. And it's a good way to be able to compare between those styles of filmmaking, some more conventional film styles and some more artistic and free, let's call it like that, free styles of filmmaking. But you said you didn't like German cinema that much. I need to
No.
ask you, for example, let's say Fassbinder or Herzog or Murnau doesn't tell you that much.
Well,
No.
I don't like them. I don't like. I think they're the actors are usually very bad, like overly histrionic. The scripts are very poor. The filming is not aesthetically very pleasing. All of these directors that you mentioned, I don't like them.
I can tell you that I do like them, but at the same time, I can understand what you mean, because you know, it's easier for a native person to understand these small intricacies of the films that are spoken in their own language, and you know, the intonation of the dialogues, the way they speak, the way they act. It can become very easy for a native person to tell if it's doing too much, if it's going too theatrical, too artificial. I feel the same way with Portuguese cinema, for example. I have Portuguese filmmakers that I appreciate very much as well, but in most creations, it just sounds very off-putting. It sounds fake. It sounds forced. It sounds artificial. Exactly. Forced, so I can certainly understand what you mean. All right. So tell us a little bit about how your acquaintance with Tarkovsky came about. When did you first watch one of his films, and how was that first encounter with Tarkovsky? How did you feel about it?
Well, I watched Tarkovsky already as a teenager, not understanding anything about the movies, simply because that's when he got like really famous in the West, like in the late 1970s and then throughout the 1980s mostly. And he only has, I think, 7 movies or so. So I watched most of them, if not all of them. I don't remember all of them, but yeah. So he was like a major movie director to take note of. So he was very much present in kind of the cultural world of the Germany of the 1980s. So, the first movie that I can remember that I watched is the one we're going to talk about tonight, Stalker. And I watched this on TV late night, and I still have that memory of watching that movie. And I must have been like maybe 16 or 17 years old or something like this. And yeah, it was mystifying. It was kind of horrifying. It was also boring. At the same time. And I couldn't really make sense of these things, but I mean, that's what at least I guess I did, but I guess many teenagers, right? You're exposed to kind of, you expose yourself to literature, to philosophy, to art, to movies, to music that you might not understand, but somehow you're still fascinated in a way that when you understand more, you're not that fascinated anymore. So it's an interesting kind of a mixture between not understanding and fascination. And then I watched, of course, also like Solaris is maybe the one the kind of the most memorable. But I guess my favorite one is Andrei Rublev, which I watched just a few years ago, and that also I was deeply impressed by that one as well. Even though I watched it when I was already old, I was still fascinated. I was basically fascinated by all the Tarkovsky movies I watched.
Yeah, absolutely.
But usually when I mean, this is a new thing for me tonight, and I'm happy we're doing this, because on the one hand, I do think that movies are philosophically very relevant and interesting, but most movies I don't really, and maybe even intentionally, I don't really reflect on them too much. I just let them, I allow myself to be impressed by them without thinking too much about them.
Yeah, that's one perspective that I try to pass through my channel, is to entice people to not just watch the films, but trying to understand what is actually being told through them, the ideas that lie underneath the text, the dialogues, the way that images work together with sound.
Right.
What does that evoke in us in terms both emotionally and intellectually? It's a kind of approach to filmmaking that I try to persuade people to do, because I don't often find that with the people with which I talk about films in real life. Mostly they just talk about the film and they say that it's good, they enjoyed it, it was fun and all that. But when you try to pry a bit deeper into the concept of the films, into the ideas of the films, it becomes a bit harder for them, because they don't usually think about it that much about the film. They look at film mostly perhaps as a distraction, maybe to lots of people it works like that. But you were talking about your experience with Stalker, and it was actually the first film I saw of Tarkovsky as well. And the impression is it was pretty similar to yours, and I felt like it was mystifying, like you said. I couldn't make much sense of it back then. I was 17, 18 years maybe, and I couldn't really understand what was going on. I thought it was really boring as well. I was thinking to myself, why are these scenes dragging along for so long, and why are they not saying anything? And what's happening? Nothing's happening. I don't really understand what's going on. And to make matters worse, the first time that I watched it, I had come from a dinner, and perhaps I had drank a bit more than I should have, and so I came a bit not really able to make the sense of the film come about in my head. So it made things worse, but at the same time I felt that there was something in there that was so hard to describe and so alluring. I don't know if it was the pace or the beauty of the images or the music conjoined with those images, that there was something that touched me very deeply. I had never seen a film like that. Obviously, it was a film that it was so different from everything that I had seen before that, and had this very intense, very strange experience with it. At that time, I wasn't even aware that a film could touch us like that.
Right.
How would you compare a film from Tarkovsky and a film from, let's say, a regular film from Hollywood, from the standard of Hollywood that we had for some time now? Films that are more oriented perhaps towards profit, and a film that is more oriented towards engaging with the audience on a deeper level. What are the main differences that you find?
Well, this is a good question. I think the difference is vast. And I think you already mentioned one of the major reasons, if not the major reason, why the difference is so vast, and that's the commodification aspect, right?
Exactly.
I have a soft spot for socialism and communism, and I lived 2 years when I was young in communist China in the 1980s. When China was still very communist. And that is very different from the communism that existed in Eastern Europe. It was actually a pretty well functioning communism at that time. But I also, and then of course we had like also Eastern Germany was communist, and Eastern European movies I already watched as a child, and I was already kind of fascinated by them. And because in Eastern Europe they made very good movies for children, right? This was something, and I think that's similar for Tarkovsky, right? That in these Eastern European communist countries, art was a way for intellectuals to do stuff that they couldn't really do in many other areas in society, right? To be creative, as long as they weren't too political. That's why they made so good movies for children, right? Because they were not like really that politically problematic. And at the same time, which is of course a very good thing, they had a lot of time and they were not really that much subject to commodification, to the capitalist notion of art. And also, of course, they weren't really, didn't have the pressures of what I like to call prophilicity, right? So you don't have what also bothers me with the German movies, that you always have these kind of trying people to whatever, it's kind of very vain, right? The movie business speaks a lot to vanity. And you don't really have that in the Eastern European, in the communist, at least not to that extent. You don't have that to that extent, as you have that in the capitalist movie industry. So I don't want to glorify the communist, socialist movies. I'm not a specialist, but I think that's you can tell the difference, right? And I think the difference is due, to a large extent, to the different modes of production.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a main difference. You know, obviously you have artistic films coming out of the United States. You had for many decades, but comparing, for example, with Russia, let's say, or even with some other European countries, the difference is very large. And I think it's because of what you said. There's, you know, for example, in America, I would say that there was this tendency to have some vanity associated with the role of the filmmaker, the director of films. He's a person of power. He's a person that brings these films to people and makes a lot of money with it. So he's a person that you ought to listen to and you ought to respect because of that, because of how much money he makes at the box office, for example. That's probably one of the aspects. And I would say that in Russia, certainly you probably wouldn't have that kind of pressure. Obviously, films were still meant to be successful, no doubt, but the role of the filmmaker didn't have that impression, that same impression that you'd have in America, I would say. And because of that, the outcome, you'd have more artistic freedom, even if enclosed in a socialist ideology, in a communist ideology, you would have some freedom and you have some space for creativity that would allow you to explore other areas within that framework. And the result is, yeah, of course, you have people like Tarkovsky or Mikhail Kalatozov or some other Soviet Russian filmmakers that made incredible movies throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Yeah, and that's a huge difference, I would say. Not only that, but you know, you got those aspects like the pace of the film. You know, you have a film like Stalker, and it's a film that is very languid. You have a very languorous approach to it. The scenes develop, and you don't see too many cuts. Most of them are long takes, and you know, for me, that gives you an impression of reality, of the things that are happening on screen. They develop in a very natural way, and you can identify with that. At least I can identify with that. Whereas in films that are based more on the technique, on the montage, you have plenty of cuts. And to me, I can understand the purpose of it. You can achieve really interesting, creative things with that, but you don't get the same impression that you get with the film that is based on a realistic depiction of time like you get on with Tarkovsky. That's, for me, probably one of the things that makes Stalker and Tarkovsky's filmography detached from other styles of filmmaking. And yeah, I was wondering, you've watched Stalker, and what kind of scenes particularly marked you? What scenes have made a lasting impression that you could say?
The scenes with the girl, with the daughter. First, right at the beginning, when they are shown like lying in the bed, and then you see the face of the girl, and it has this kind of spiritual beauty to it, right? It's a very kind of amazing beauty of this kind of spiritual kind, and this then is highlighted even more later on when the girl appears with this kind of golden thing over her head. I don't know what the English word for this is, and then it's in color, right, as opposed to everything else that was in this kind of black and white style. And again, this has a very, I still have kind of goosebumps when I think about right now, when I talk about these images. They are so strong, so powerful. And it's this kind of, it's this kind of spiritual beauty that is definitely, I guess, a reference to Russian icons or things like this. Also the color, the golden color, and not the last scene. I don't really like the last scene, which is like in a American movie or so, when she moves the glasses with the eyes. But these other scenes where you see her face, both at the beginning and then this golden thing, that has had a very powerful, made a very powerful immediate impression on me.
Yeah, certainly, I would agree. For example, the scene in the bed at the beginning, it's extremely pure, I would say. The way that is framed and the way that it unfolds with these movements from the side. And at the same time, I think that scene is a pretty good example of one characteristic that differs from other styles of filmmaking. For example, when the camera reaches the stalker, you can see that he's awake, he's not asleep, and he's looking, and he has this certain expression in his countenance, and it immediately tells you that, okay, he's thinking about something, but he's not voicing that. He's not saying, oh, I feel worried, or he doesn't say, I want to do something or anything. You just take that from his face. You don't need to say anything, but you can interpret it as the way that he's looking towards his daughter and his wife. You can tell that something is going to happen, and he's thinking very clearly, very specifically about something that eventually we'll learn about it.
Right.
And, it's the power of allowing people to take from the film the information without voicing that information specifically. You can already tell people things that are about to happen, certain moods. You can communicate certain moods and ideas without necessarily having to spell it out, as it happens in most of the films. In most of the films, I feel like people sometimes talk too much in many films. They say everything that you need to know. And as a spectator, I feel like that's sometimes an overload of information. I much prefer to sometimes read a person's emotional state from his face, from not the things that the person says, but the way that this person behaves, the way that this person looks and walks about in the set or in the scenario. This is, for me, one of the greatest differences as well. And like you said, there are so many pure scenes in the film. For example, one of the scenes that marked me, when they're on the railroad and they're going to the zone, and you see the three of them, the back of their heads are turned to the camera. You don't see their faces that well, but you get the feeling that you're getting slowly into their heads, into the anxiety that's happening inside their heads. They're about to move into a zone, into a place where they heard it's very dangerous. The stalker knows it's very dangerous. The other two guys, the professor and the writer, don't know that much about it. And you can feel that this tension is building up, not only because of the way that the scenes are framed, but also because of the sound. You hear the tracks. They have this hypnotic sound to it, and it sort of gets you into a mood that is very, very intense. And once they reach the zone, it's got this color. Before it had this kind of sepia yellowish color, but once they get to the zone, it's like the scene is building up to this pinnacle where suddenly we get the zone. It's revealed to us in its absolute beauty. It's incredible, those greens of the grass and the trees. That's one of the scenes that has marked me very much. And there are plentiful others in the film. And since I talked about the characters, I was wondering if you would be interested in talking to us about the three characters, the three main characters. What do you think of them, how they are characterized? So the stalker, the professor, and the writer, since the three of them have pretty distinct personalities to them, have very distinct ideas to them. And talk us a bit about the way that they are framed in the film.
Well, for me, they are the key to the whole movie, which is the three protagonists. There's hardly anyone else in the movie, so that's not something specifically, difficult to notice. But I mean, they set up, I think, the framework of meaning of the movie. I think they represent very obviously the they represent different ways of life, different ways of being, different ways of existence, different ways of thinking of humankind. So I think it's they are general symbols of the different ways of being human, existentially and intellectually. And so the professor represents science, represents technology, represents this kind of rational way of thinking. The writer represents art, philosophy, literature, imagination, but in a secular way. And the stalker represents religion and the spiritual. So I think that's a very kind of heavy, three very heavy pillars, and they're all highly symbolic figures, right? Everything in the movie is highly symbolic, but the three protagonists are like very, very paradigmatic symbols, I think, of the three basic, let's say, existential and intellectual orientations of being human. That's what I think they are. And the interesting thing about them about the movie is they're all kind of trying to make sense, and they're incapable of that within an overwhelming complexity, right? Like we are in the world, and no matter which of these modes we're operating in, like even in science, right? Our knowledge of things is very, very limited. And we can't really, we're still like just facing this huge mystery. We're just facing it in different ways, right? If you're a scientist, you don't have any answers to the big questions. And likewise, neither as a philosopher nor as a religious person. You're facing a mystery that you're within. And you have this specific mode, but each specific mode makes you somehow helpless. So it only gets you so far, and only makes you realize that most of the things you don't really get, you don't really understand. So I think that's one major thing. They all try to make sense of reality of the zone, and they all somehow fail. But then in addition to this, they also fail communicating with one another. They have very strong difficulties in understanding one another, in communicating with one another, in cooperating. They can't even cooperate efficiently, True. Right? It's extremely difficult for them to cooperate. So that really shows the movie is, I read it as both theological, but also as an existential, a very existentialist, 20th century existentialist movie that shows basically the despair of all these three modes, the forlornness. These are Sartrean terms, just came to my mind, but they are key. This kind of frustration in with regard to not only the sense making, but also to of the world, but also making sense and communicating and cooperating with one another.
Yeah. That's great input. I think the three characters indeed are very carefully depicted in a way that they represent three different ways of existing and looking at the world. And it represents very well the tensions between these three different facets, the facets of science, of art, and of faith, of religion. And I think it's very interesting that, for example, I would say that perhaps the writer is the closest representation of Tarkovsky, but at the same time, both the stalker and the professor have certain facets of him as well, in a way.
Right.
So he's kind of representing himself through these three characters that have a huge difficulty in understanding one another, and this tension between the three of them, it gives a very interesting image of the world, of society, of the way that
Right.
we look at the world.
Yes.
Tarkovsky did that in a very alluring way. And the writer, like you said, there's a very strong existentialist strain in the film, particularly from the writer, because he, for example, he says that there's a huge boredom in the world, that he's never seen a happy person in his life. And then he talks about, for example, about how it was much more interesting in the Middle Ages because every garden had a goblin, every church had its own god. He's depicting this skepticism in a way that he looks towards the world, and it can be very, very heavy to think about these themes and the way that he puts these themes out there in the film. But at the same time, I think this is a way for us to think about the world that we're living in through this film. He's providing us with certain questions that perhaps we're supposed to question on our own living, on our own existence. And I think Stalker does it very beautifully, the film. I haven't seen too many films that have placed this emphasis on this intellectual discourse and dialogue. It's one of the main facets of the film, I would say. And you said that you make a theological interpretation of the film as well. And it's true, in the film, for example, you have at least 3 different times where you got these quotes from the Bible. You got a quote from the book of Daniel, you got a quote from the Revelations of St. John, the Apocalypse, and from the Gospel of Luke. And could you please tell us a bit about your theological interpretation of the film, the way that these themes of religion are enveloped in the film? How do you see them?
Can I answer this question indirectly, or can I first allow me to first say something different, and then I go back to your question?
Certainly, of course.
I want to prepare it. I like to point out also regarding what you just said about the 3 characters and the general kind of approach of the film, or the general idea of the film. I think in addition to these 3 ways of existence, 3 modes of being human, the film operates with very strong tensions, not only between these 3 modes of existence, but 3 different kinds of contradictions, different types of incongruities, I call. So obviously we have the zone and the normal world, right? So we have this duality. And we have other, I think, similarly strong and meaningful distinctions, contradiction, opposites, incongruities that have to be taken into account in order to finally get to the question. And one of them, as you mentioned, beauty. But this beauty is a very strange beauty within utter ugliness. Actually, everything basically in the film is completely desolate, right? It's complete desolation, it's complete ugliness, it's complete devastation, destruction, right? And everything is gray. And even when it gets to the colors, it's this green, it's not a pleasant green, and everything is in this kind of unpleasant green. And yet he manages to, nevertheless, within this ugliness, show somehow the beauty of everything ugly. So it's a very strong contrast, basically all the time, how this kind of beauty somehow, appears within ugliness. And again, I think that's an image of the world, of existence, right? Existence, very ugly, very brutal. And yet we kind of yearn for, and that's what art does, it kind of produces within a completely desolate ugliness, it recycles it into beauty. So that's a very strong tension. I think that's number one. And similarly, as a side effect, is human beauty and human ugliness. I mean, they're all like dressed very shabbily. They're very poor. They are not like traditional beautiful. They are filthy. They're really, everyone is basically filthy. And nevertheless, and they in the mud, and nevertheless he manages to show absolute beauty in that, right? because human existence is also very ugly, very filthy, right? The human biology is not, and you manage nevertheless to produce beauty within this kind of filth. And then we have nature, right? The nature is like the environment is like total environmental pollution. Everything is like totally polluted, and everything is rusty, and everything is rotten, and everything is dirty, and nevertheless you see how nature like breaks through. You see like the at the beginning there's a scene, oh, that this porcupine killed all the flowers, right? And so, but nevertheless somehow nature and the beauty of nature, be it like in the plants or in the water, or we can go back to the water, which of course very important, or in the dog, right? And so this kind of also how nature emerges within this kind of pollution, right? And lives in there, and life comes through. And then also the tension between, you said on the one hand nothing really happens, and yet there is constant tension, right? So that's Absolutely. It's constant tension, even though in boredom. And again, that's like an existential metaphor. Life is like super boring in many ways, but at the same time there is kind of constant attention, right? And constant anxiety as well, right? And then there's, I think similarly, there's nothing really makes sense, right? We have neither the plot has a kind of complete, like, doesn't really make that much sense. But again, like they try to explain what the zone is. No one really knows. No one really knows what's going on, right? It's completely impossible to construct like an overarching framework of meaning. And nevertheless, every single sentence makes a lot of meaning. Everything is so meaningful that they say, right? So that's another tension between this complete meaninglessness and the emergence of these super meaningful things that they say all the time. And then what you have basically is then a unity of all these opposites that seem to be not combinable, and yet they're closely intertwined. And that brings me finally to the question that, because another thing is the secular and the sacred, that basically everything that happens is completely secular, and yet it is somehow a completely sacred religious quest all the time. There is no church, there is no talk much of, that this is somehow the divine. That's not really mentioned. It's supposed to be some form of whatever, nuclear disaster or something. It's not really spelled out what the zone exactly is, or some alien visitation thing or something like this. But I mean, it's clearly the conflict and the incongruity between the secular and the sacred. And yet within this kind of complete sacredness, within this complete kind of secularity, the sacredness shines through very, very strongly all the time. So yeah, I think that the film is clearly kind of also a religious existentialism. I mentioned Andrei Rublev before. I think it's in that tradition.
Yeah, definitely.
There is this fascination with this kind of beauty and meaning beyond comprehension, right? That there is this is like the meaning of the sacred, that it is a beauty that is beyond comprehension, that it is a meaning
ineffable in a way.
Yes, of course, but it's very powerful at the same time, and we're in it, and we're kind of just simply we're lost in it, right? Everything we do is just vain. Everything is just a failure, and yet we're somehow given the grace. There is this kind of that we are kind of that, which is an important, of course, element of faith, right? There's this kind of
and hope somehow, as well.
Yeah, and it's this humility and suffering they're all suffering, they're all poor, right? That's also a big thing of particularly traditional Christianity, right? The blessed are the poor, right? And so this humility, this suffering, but in the midst of an extremely overwhelming, unfathomable spiritual presence. So that's I think again an existential, the religious mode as an existential condition that we're living, and that's I think what the movie shows. You asked me personally earlier, I didn't say that Tarkovsky. I think for me, I'm not a religious person, even though this may sound like what I'm just saying, but I do have a kind of a soft spot for religion, particularly in Russian literature, Dostoevsky, and also in movies like Tarkovsky or Terrence Malick, for that matter. So this is personally my approach to religion and spirituality, which from a philosophical perspective, I often reject. But in this kind of movie or in literature, there is this kind of religious mode which has does have a strong appeal to me, and maybe that's another reason why I like Tarkovsky, because it gives me something that in my philosophy I avoid.
Well, first of all, that was an incredibly thorough and very stimulating answer. I think that you managed to peel back so many layers in that single answer to the question that I made. I think that for me, even it has brought some very interesting perspectives on the film. And I think you hit the spot very well when you say that the film Stalker is about this conjoining of incongruities, of contrasts. You have this dynamic, this tension between two different opposing aspects of existence, let's say, and you can feel that very, very well, very strongly. And you talked about the film. You have this permeating anxiety all over it, this kind of dread all over it, and at the same time, the film is so slow, and for some people it would be called boring perhaps, but I've heard somebody say this once about Stalker, that Stalker is like an adventure film in slow motion. It's got the ingredients of an adventure film in a way, but it goes by in slow motion, in a very slow pace, and I found that description very, very intriguing. But yeah, concerning your answer, I think that was very in-depth, and it showcases just how many layers and the levels of meaning that you can find in the film. And I firmly believe that this is not just some random interpretation or that we are imposing our own views on the film. I think that it becomes very clear in the film. It becomes very clear for anyone that watches very attentively. And yeah, I think that you mentioned as well the duality and how it relates, for example, with the yin and yang in Taoism, for example. And we should talk about this sequence where the Stalker, he quotes the Tao Te Ching, specifically the chapter 76, and it's interesting. When I watched the film like 2 or 3 times without having even recognized that passage. But when I was doing my studies in England, I had read the Tao Te Ching for the first time a couple of months before, and then I was watching Stalker, and I felt like when that part came in, I was like, I know this sounds very familiar. At the time, I was beginning my own personal studies into religion and philosophy. I had read Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, the Dhammapada of Buddhism, and I read the Tao Te Ching as well, the Upanishads, and I was trying to remember to which one it belonged, that passage, and I went to all those books, and I finally found it on the Tao Te Ching, and I was like, I knew that there was something in here that came from something special that I had read very recently. I was wondering if you can tell us a bit about the way that is framed in the film, this concept of the book of Tao Te Ching specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised that out of a sudden this quote comes, because I'm familiar with the text. I translated it and teaching it this semester actually. So and it's a very short text, so it's something that therefore I would immediately recognize and first found very odd, right? It seemed to be it was a surprise, but I mean the chapter is refers to or mentions a an important imagery that you find in Taoism, especially in the Tao Te Ching, namely that when life is young, it's soft, like a baby or
pliable,
like a young plant, and when we get old, we get stiffer and stiffer, and unfortunately that's very true. I noticed that also. Yes, so that's the imagery that the chapter basically right, that softness means newborn, and hardness and stiffness, it means close to death. Exactly. So this, of course, in a Taoist context, it has to do with, like, the Tao Te Ching is very much about the reproduction of life. And the Tao is a notion of the reproduction of life, the course of reproduction, Tao as way or course. And so these are basically is an illustration of what this course consists in, right? And that speaks again to an important existential condition, which I think then Tarkovsky reconnects with the Christian context, that it's an image of mortality, right? So I don't think that the movie is very Taoist, to be honest. But I think what Tarkovsky took from this passage, which is of course correct, that it depicts somehow the existential description of mortality and the process from life to death, which is another existential fundamental thing that is embedded in the movie through, for instance, this chapter, and then of course has both an secular strong existential meaning, Heidegger, whatever, life as being towards death, but then of course also in the Christian existentialism, where the mortality and then the spiritual, the divine, is that which is basically the answer to human mortality. So both in secular and in sacred existentialism, human mortality is a central condition. And I think, again, like Tarkovsky took this because it's something in the Tao Te Ching that speaks to this existential condition.
Yes, absolutely. It connects directly with the nature, the way that nature is depicted. Like you were saying, there's this beauty, this life, and there's this death at the same time. There's these two different aspects that are part of the same coin, two faces of the same coin, let's say, and that are inextricable from each other. They are inseparable. And the way that he puts it in the film Through Nature, for example, finds a parallel perhaps on this passage as well from the Tao Te Ching.
Right.
There's
another thing, I'm sorry if I interrupt you,
I forgot to say this.
Because in the Tao Te Ching, also a very important image is water, which is the main image, I guess, in Stalker, right? And water is also in many cultures, because that's what it actually is, an image for life force, right? For the organic as such, right? Its simplest form is water. So that's also a bridge between Tarkovsky's art and symbolism and Taoist symbolism.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing I forgot to say.
Water has a very specific representation in his films. The elements, in a general sense, are depicted in his films in a very personal way. And water in particular, you see through his films, in Stalker, in a very heightened sense, the reflexes of the puddles, the way that they reflect the nature, but the sound as well, the sound of the water drops in the tunnel, for example, in the meat grinder.
Right.
the constant sound of
Right.
dripping and the rushing, the gushing of the river, of the water, not the waterfall, but the way that the water was coming through in that sequence. And it not only creates this very, very richly textured oral environment, but it also tells something of the way that he sees water as permeating the world and the existence of their characters in a way that is fundamental, that is necessary, and then once again it ties with the nature, the concept of nature that he imprints in his film. Definitely. I also wanted to ask you about another concept in his film that happens in a very brief manner when the writer says, "I search the truth. When I find it, it turns to nothing." And it seems to me that what the writer is trying to say is that there are some doubts when it comes to this objective, definitive truth that we seek to find for each one of us. Once again, it goes back to this ambiguity, these contrasts and paradoxes. I was wondering what would you have to say from a philosophical perspective on this phrase that the writer used in Stalker?
Well, brings us back to what I said earlier, that you can construct meaning and truth, but it's always very contingent, and it doesn't match up to the big questions. And that's a very frustrating experience, right? That that truth in the general larger sense that we really want to get at remains completely elusive. So, and I think that's more or less what he says in that sentence. And then again, we experience this inability to achieve truth in the three different senses of the spiritual, where the divine remains elusive, in science, where also the ultimate answers remain elusive, and then in literature and art and philosophy. But yet, in a Sisyphus-like way, we continuously construct these. We continuously have this kind of quest for meaning.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Also, I was just talking about the sound design of the film and the way that water, for example, is depicted from a sound perspective. There's this idea floating. It talks about, for example, music as an artistic form that has no intrinsic ideas and associations when you look at it from the point of view that, you know, it's an arrangement of notes and chords and tones and melodies, but it doesn't have an intrinsic idea among those notes. Music works as a direct penetration of the soul, according to the Stalker. Do you think that cinema could work the same way? I asked this because Tarkovsky, he wrote a book called Sculpting in Time, and he makes the argument that cinema with a certain shape, with a certain form, can actually work the same way as music without the ideas and associations that a person usually imprints on it. A film can work and move a person emotionally in a very personal way. Do you think that film can work like that, as Tarkovsky has said?
Well, I guess we already, to an extent, affirmed that both when we were describing the experience we both had when we were watching the movie when we were teenagers. And it had some form of direct penetration of the soul, simply because we were intellectually unable to perceive it in any other manner. So it greatly affected us, but we couldn't put it in words. We didn't even know why. So in this sense, there is the kind of this direct penetration of the soul. And yet, from a philosophical perspective, I'm not a fan of that notion. I think we always need to, and that's also, of course, what we're doing right now. We need to come up with interpretations. Otherwise, everything is meaningless to us. And these interpretations don't have to be intellectual interpretations. Again, there are different interpretations, the scientific interpretation, the artistic interpretation. But even if you play a piece of music, Pedro, what is it called? You interpret the music, right? And that's not in an intellectual sense. You need it to interpret in a personal form. And it's the same thing, of course, in the theological, in the spiritual mode, right? These are also forms of interpretation. I don't think from a theoretical perspective that there is such thing as a direct penetration of the soul. Music in itself is already an interpretation. And then listening to music, even if we don't intellectually listen to it, or the watching of a movie, even if we watch it as teenagers, we somehow interpret what we are seeing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be humans. We wouldn't be human. So I think it's a nice image, direct penetration of the soul, but I don't think it's very subtle. And I don't think it's very true.
I see. Yeah, the reason why I asked is because obviously Tarkovsky makes the case for that argument in his book, and he talks about it in the film directly. That was a quote from the Stalker. But I was wondering myself, because, for example, I'm not an emotional person, let's say, but for some reason there are certain pieces of art that move me without me really understanding why. Let's say the Stabat Mater of Pergolesi.
Yeah, that's completely true. I mean, the idea that yes, of the direct penetration. So again, it's a very also religious idea, right? That you kind of
definitely
in this completely passive mode, and you get somehow like whatever Mary got pregnant with Jesus. It was like a direct penetration without anything that she did, right? And yeah, that's analogy, and somehow we find like that stuff aesthetically, spiritually hits us in this way, and we're kind of just in a passively way hit by it. But again, from a philosophical perspective, I don't think that's actually happening. We're always observing, we're always constructing things, and we do so with whatever the emotional capacities that we have already. We do so with the intellectual or the spiritual, you name it, whatever you want, aesthetical capacities that we have. It's basically a Kantian point, right? That we have certain cognitive structures, aesthetic structures, and these structures enable us to produce these sensations. We're not merely passive recipients of anything.
Exactly. Yeah, I would have to agree with you. I have the same impression. I just always wondered why it was that for some reason there are certain works of art that even without knowing what they are about, they have moved me to tears, or made me feel shivers. Or,
yes, of course, yes.
Yeah.
But this, because we have the capacity to feel shiver, right? And
yeah.
Anyways, yeah, it's an interesting philosophical question. But
certainly,
of course, some of the most powerful feelings we get are those feelings that we think overcome us without our doing, just like Mary's pregnancy. But again, that's a nice theological story, but maybe Mary wasn't that innocent.
Okay, so I got another question for you. I think with some philosophical substance, perhaps you could help me and some viewers regarding Stalker. There's this event where they're about to enter the meat grinder, and the Stalker says that somebody has to go first, and he has these two matchsticks that he says he's gonna break one and make one shorter than the other. So between him and the writer, whoever takes the long matchstick will have to go through the meat grinder. And he presents both of them, but intact, to the writer, which he unknowingly takes, and then he moves onto the meat grinder. However, at the end, the writer says that he was aware actually of what the Stalker did, and that it wasn't a choice of the writer, but it was actually a choice of the Stalker for the writer to go through the meat grinder. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, who had the choice to go through the meat grinder? Was it the Stalker, or was it the writer? Was it the Stalker because he presented two equally long matchsticks? Was it the writer because he took the decision to take a matchstick from his hand? And in another level, when we transpose this to the real world, to society, my question would be, if we are environmentally conditioned, are we actually free on our decisions, on the decisions that we take? Could you please elucidate me and our viewers on that question?
Yeah, I think you kind of already answered the question yourself with what you said at the end, right? And again, this is kind of religious and the theological framework that this is meant to be that way, right? And the Stalker somehow operates in this religious framework that everything is somehow meant to be in some way, but for mysterious reasons that he doesn't see through. He's just kind of this, he just, again, what's the term? He devotes himself, he just offers himself to be, and accepts that, right? The divine logic that he doesn't understand. So that's like the same thing. I think he's kind of, he doesn't want to cheat, right? But I don't think it's like he doesn't have bad intentions. He just somehow thinks that this is how it's meant to be, that the writer, he can never go first, right? But he doesn't really know why. And the writer also kind of similarly, similar thing again from the existentialist, from the secular perspective, that he somehow also accepts the existential situation that he is in. He doesn't, in that sense, resists it, but then proves himself in that situation that he's thrown into. It's kind of this thrownness, a Heideggerian term again. And within this thrownness, you prove yourself. It doesn't matter what the existential situation is. Ultimately, it doesn't matter if he goes first or second. He doesn't really know. And so it makes no difference to him. And he accepts that and accepts the circumstances, but then proves himself in the circumstances. So that's, again, a secular existentialist and a religious existentialist way of not operating simply on the basis of free will, right? Yeah, so that's one way, I guess, of reading this this interesting scene.
Yeah, like you said, it's a way for Tarkovsky to combine these two aspects or interpretations, a faith-oriented perhaps interpretation and a rationally oriented interpretation. He does it very well, obviously, throughout his film, and this is just another instance, I guess. There's an image in the film that I have only noticed in one of my latest viewings of the film. First of all, I have to say that Tarkovsky said he was against symbolism, in the understanding that symbolism, when it is represented in dead symbols, as a way just to relay a meaning that doesn't affect the viewership of his films. But he nevertheless, he knew that his films were bound to evoke some meaning on his viewers, and he wanted to have that in a personal way, different for every person. There's this image in Stalker where you got these fish within a bowl in water. So the fish are swimming inside this bowl and the bowl is surrounded by water. So it gives this impression that there's something going on in here that has some meaning beyond being just a pretty image. You know, it's just the fish are inside the water and they're living. And in a way they are separated from the world in which they could live as well, in which is part of their life. They need water to live, and they have water inside the bowl, but also surrounding them. Do you have any sort of perhaps an interpretation for this image? Because in my head, it's almost as if Tarkovsky is saying that we have separated ourselves from the breadth and the wholeness of the universe, perhaps through technology. There's a hint of critique of technology throughout the film, which we can go afterwards as well. But I was wondering, what would you say concerning this image, if you have some specific thoughts on it?
Well, I mean, we talked about it earlier, right? Water is maybe the main image, if there is a main image in this movie, and as you said, maybe in Tarkovsky's movies in general. And I think connecting this with not only Taoism, but many also culture, water is the element of life. It's kind of the whole, as you said, the total universe. It's this whole that we can't fathom, right? It's the life force. It's the total cosmos and the organic, right? That which mystifies us, and that at the same time that which constitutes us. And so, yeah, I think that, like the whole movie, this image, we're always in water. We're always in the whole kind of cosmic life, and yet we are like in a little. We're all just like in a little bowl, in a little fish bowl or something like this, right? And we never get to the. We never get to understand the general
The
thing.
totality. Yeah, the
Yes.
totality of reality. Yes, that's the understanding that I got from that image. And you're right, it comes back to what you were saying earlier, this inability perhaps to reach out this wholeness, this totality. And it's this tension that once again we've seen between the characters is now transposed to this tiny example, this tiny little image of the fish in
Right.
this bowl. And like I said, I felt that there's a sort of rather subtle, perhaps not that subtle, but there's a sense that technology at some point, Tarkovsky is evoking some questions, not just being critical, but perhaps asking people to consider their relationship with technology. And as you know, my background in philosophy is very superficial. I have a very cursory knowledge of philosophy, but I have read in the past, for example, Martin Heidegger's The Question Concerning Technology, Men and Techniques from Oswald Spengler, and the One-Dimensional Man from Marcuse. And there were some questions in those works that I felt like ringed similar to what Tarkovsky is doing in his film as well. When he, for example, when the Stalker says that all your technology for people to work less and consume more are all crutches, artificial limbs. Mankind exists in order to create works of art, which is unselfish compared to all other activities. When the Stalker says that, and in contrast, when you have nature represented very positively, very benevolently, even with that inherent ugliness amidst it, I can't help but feeling that there's this doubt concerning our relationship, humans, with technology in Tarkovsky's work. What can you tell me about that?
Yes, I fully agree with you. I think it's a very good observation. And yeah, there is this critique of technology and aspect of environmentalism as well in it. And you see, like, in all these rotten things that are in the zone, right? All the technology that is dysfunctional, that is kaputt, as you say in German and in English, right? So that's destroyed, that's no longer working. There's so many kaputt things. All the objects are kaputt. And then actually now I'm thinking of, and then the phone rings, and that somehow that this works and the light goes on. That is kind of a big surprise, because you don't expect any technology to work there, right? And so that's a kind of almost comical element. But the movie is not good in comedy. That's maybe its only downside. So yeah, that's an interesting scene, right? Because all the other technological objects are destroyed and dysfunctional, right? So, and again, that shows somehow the power of life over technology, right? And that the technology is somehow even more mortal than life is mortal. And so, of course, also like this, the limits of science and technology from a theological perspective. That's a very, I think, a major theme. Yeah, and you see all these objects like under the water, right?
You have
Whatever.
guns, you have coins, you have
Yes,
icons, even you have all
exactly.
sorts of
And
stuff.
they represent all the different technologies, right? The war weapon is a big thing. Then, but you mentioned money, economy, right?
Yeah.
Then healthcare, right? The syringe,
Syringes. Yeah.
yeah, and time, like you see clocks, right? And so you see all these objects of technology, and this quote, right? And that human invented these. The quote, what was it, like, with the consumption and the crutches and these artificial limbs, right? They're all these artificial. They're all these artificial limbs, and as such, they are. They are quite they are very limited limbs. They're not like as powerful as the water. It's also again a Taoist idea, right? That the water is the most powerful thing of all, and the technology ultimately cannot is always only goes that far again.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I was thinking just now, because the fact that they are put underwater, for example, a gun underwater probably won't work. It will stop working. No. The icon, the layers
and
of.
That's also like there's even this scene where the stalker pushes the gun.
Exactly. Yes, and
probably then at the end the bomb.
Yes, the bomb as well. I was thinking the money will probably get rusty as well.
Yes.
The syringes, all of that. In a way, it's almost as if saying that, technology is limited, and water as a symbol for life seems to overcome the technology, right?
Yes.
It's an aspect that's very interesting in his work, very clear, very obvious as well. At the end, they put the bomb, he throws the bomb underwater, and it seems like there's this oil coming through this dark liquid that is spreading in the water. You got the fishes nearby, and it's like he's saying that technology is probably polluting the essence of life, our life force, in a sense. That's one interpretation that I think as well. I wanted to ask you something else. Towards the end of the film, the stalker is accused by the writer to be working as a stalker because he has power over people. He accuses Stalker to be doing this merely for the sake of controlling people, perhaps as a power trip of sorts. He gains immense influence over the people. He drives them to the right places. He forces people to trust him in a way. But the Stalker kind of defends himself, and he expresses empathy, the desire to help these people that are hopeless. At the beginning of the film, he says that the zone and the room only allows the hopeless people to come in. And, he expresses this willingness to help people that have lost all hope. And I was wondering if you could tell us what perspective do you align more with it? Do you think that the Stalker is using this for personal gain as a means to obtain power, or do you think he's actually doing this altruistically, selflessly, to help those that are in despair, those that need help and seek hope and comfort and haven't found it?
Well, the thing is that the difference may not be that may not be that much of a difference between the two. I mean, the main theme, which we didn't even talk about yet of the movie, is the desires and wishes, and the wish for power, wish that that's what the point of going to the zone, according to like the plot of the movie, is that somehow your unknown wishes get fulfilled, right?
Yeah, at the room, inside the room, yeah.
Yes, inside the room. That's the main theme of the whole movie, of the plot. At the beginning of the movie, I found this stuck. Maybe this is the sentence that stuck to me most. It's quite at the beginning when the writer says that, of course, we don't even know what we desire, right? Mm-hmm. And so you don't really, if you desire power, yes, but even if you desire to help others, maybe you also do it because you want to have power over them, or you want to get some sort of divine reward for it if you do it in a religious way, right?
Mhm.
And so we're really not the desires, and that's an idea again that speaks to all the three modes, right? One way of looking at religion is why are you religious? Because your hopes will get fulfilled. Your ultimate desires will be somehow fulfilled in religion. Similarly in science, right? Why do we do this or create all these scientific things so that our desires for a better life and whatever will be, we want to get there faster and we want to have this or that, and we need certain technologies to do this, right? So it's also a scientific kind of wish fulfillment that we're striving at in these modes. And then of course somehow also in art and philosophy there is a different form of desire. The writer wants his he desires to have his creative capacity again, right? There are all these desires, these wishes at work, but then we don't even know if these desires are what we actually desire. And the desires are very,
in the room.
All these desires are very treacherous, as the writer says, right? So,
exactly.
And in the end, this is of course also ironic, which could also be interpreted as comical, though the movie, as I said, is not really comical. It's an anti-climax. They don't even get any desires fulfilled, right? And I think that's very, that speaks to this thing, right? We think everything is kind of, and life is somehow on a superficial level. Everything we do in life is geared towards the fulfillment of desires in these different modes, right? Religion and art or philosophy and technology and science. But in the end, no wishes are fulfilled, and they're never fulfilled. And also, basically, that's not what it has been about in the first place. And I think that's, again, from a religious perspective, from a theological perspective, that's very important to go beyond. It's a big, and I think, an important theological reflection you find in Dostoevsky and in Christianity, in Catholicism, and so forth. That you have to go beyond the mode of being religious because you want your desires to be fulfilled, right? Because that's kind of the initial idea of religion, why people are religious, and that kind of religion critiques itself about this. And so that's also in the movie, right? Because in the end, no one even wants their desires fulfilled, and somehow sees that this kind of, again, this kind of mode to seek one's desires being fulfilled is very futile. And we're not really, the purpose of religious shouldn't be and isn't really to have your desires fulfilled, and neither of any of the other other modes. So that's again like the major theme of the movie. That's the plot. They all want to go there to get their hidden desires fulfilled, that they don't even know what they are. And then in the end, no one even wants it, and it's been like becomes like totally obsolete.
True. Yet, nevertheless, the trip has managed to change them. Definitely, it has changed their outlook, their perspective.
Yes.
You know, in a way, you can say, perhaps using a cheap cliche, that the film is more about the path than the destination, isn't it?
Right.
It's more about
the
experience that they have to reach out this magical, this ideal, this special place.
Yes, it's true.
So you mentioned Dostoevsky a couple of times now, and one of the things that I find in Tarkovsky's films and in Stalker as well, naturally, is this depiction of a very special character in Dostoevsky's literature. In fact, in Russian literature, which is the wise fool, or in Orthodox Christian tradition, it's the fool for Christ. Right. It's a very, very, very special character in Russian culture. In Stalker, I believe this character is depicted through the stalker. You can especially tell that towards the end, once he comes back during the last phase of the film.
They explicitly call him that.
Oh, they explicitly, exactly. They call him that even, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think this is a type of character that occurs sometimes in the branch of philosophy. I remember, for example, Diogenes, the cynic, was supposed to be a sort of wise fool as well. Then you have Nietzsche's Zarathustra, which is despised by everyone, but he speaks this strange wisdom that actually ends up changing the people. And you also naturally, in a theological, in a religious sense, you got so many figures, both in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism, in Buddhism as well. Plenty of Chan and Zen masters have these very quirky stories where they act like crazy people, but amidst their behavior, they have this very pure wisdom to them, wisdom that transcends rationality. I wanted to hear some of your thoughts on the depiction of the wise fool in Stalker, the character.
I think it's a good question. The wise fool, I fully agree with what you said, and we have very different and all very interesting depictions of the wise fool in different philosophies and religions, and definitely in Dostoevsky and in Orthodox Christianity, it seems to be a big thing. And I'm listening a lot to now a podcast on Russian history of the Russian Revolution. And in the background, also you see even like Raskolnikov, the famous. So that was a huge thing in Russia at the time. It's not by coincidence that some of these wise fools played such an important role at the breakdown of the Tsarist regime and at the beginning of the 20th century, because there were many of these. That was a very common phenomenon, and it's also reflected in Dostoevsky's novels. And that's very interesting. And of course, it has to do with what we talked earlier, right? This Christian idea that the child is kind of very innocent, and then also this gives this kind of immediate experience of the divine, and it is kind of immediately possessed by the divine, and without any capacity to reflect it or to express it and so forth, but they kind of possessed by the divine, and that's an important and complex figure, I guess. And you have very different versions, I think, in Asia. But you also have these as you mentioned, in Zen Buddhism, right? But particularly, and you have it in Taoism, you have also very important the childlike figure, and the stupidity, the not knowing is a big thing in Taoism. But from my perspective, that's this kind of stupidity at least has to do with the capacity of not making value judgments. And not making these common distinctions between what is good and what is bad and what is and so that's a kind of because you have this foolishness that you don't that expresses itself in not being able to make the simple distinctions that constitutes let's say common wisdom. And in a Socratic sense, the not knowing is better than the knowing. So in Taoism, the figure of the fool is almost like a Socratic fool, who is wise because he does not share in the common knowledge production, so to speak. And then, of course, you have a third element to it, especially in Zen Buddhism, to an extent also in Taoism, which you also have in this Kurosawa movie, I think, which is based on Shakespeare. The jester, the fool at court, right? So who is also wiser than everyone else. And nowadays we have this in the form of the comedians, right? Good comedians are also these kind of wise fools. And yeah, these are all different figures of wise fools, and they're all very interesting. But yeah, I think it's clear that what we have in the Stalker movie is of the kind of first kind, embedded in the Russian Orthodox tradition, Christian tradition.
Yeah, as a small note, you mentioned Andrei Rublev earlier, and in there you have the jester that it has that character exactly. He's kind of comical, but he's spitting truths, let's say. He's putting out truths in a comedic manner, perhaps in an attempt to not get punished by it, but he is a sort of wise fool, like you said, a jester that has the same role, and it's very carefully depicted in it as well. You know, you got these sorts of characters as well in later films, Tarkovsky, both in The Sacrifice and in Nostalgia as well, and it's easy to understand why. Like you said, it's a character that bears a huge influence on Russian history and culture throughout the ages. There have been plenty of characters that have borne a very particular influence, both in terms of politics or ethics, in terms of religion. And like you said, it's kind of a representative of when you mentioned the stupidity that perhaps leads to immorality. You're an expert on morality as well. You've written a book about the always meant morality and immorality, let's say, and I think it ties very well with that.
Yeah, because the book is titled The Moral Fool, right? And
The Moral Fool, exactly.
Yes, so of course that speaks directly to that theme. Yes, and the idea again is like that that the moral fool is wise in the sense that he doesn't judge things. He's not judgmental in a moral sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very strong feature of Zen Buddhism, the no mind, the non-judgmental character of mind as a way to transcend these ambiguities, these value judgments. It's very interesting, but perhaps for another conversation.
Yes.
But I got one last question for you.
All right.
That concerns the film. So you're an expert on Niklas Luhmann's systems theory. I was curious about whether you had an interpretation of the film made through the perspective of the systems theory. Is there something that you can tell us about the film that could perhaps be understood in the framework of Niklas Luhmann's philosophy?
I never thought about it, but now that you bring it up, I could connect it with what we said at the beginning about the three modes, the scientific, which is in systemic systems theory perspective, the academic, the science system, the Wissenschaftssystem, and then you have the religious system as communication systems, and then you might have art or art basically, and then there are different social systems, and they all operate on the basis of their own rationalities that are not how to say that do not correspond to one another, that all have their own logic, that all have their own, and they can't connect with one another directly. So it speaks to the what in the operational closure, the systemic difference, and none of them is hierarchically privileged over the other. Every system observes all the other system on its own terms. And it's scientific, we speak scientifically about religion and art, and theologically we speak religiously about science and art, and artistically we perceive of religion and science in artistic terms, but none of them has there's no center, right? And they can't really cooperate, and that speaks to this again existential problem of the incapacity of the three to find a common language, let's say, and to cooperate. But then again, that's not at all the point. In the end, we find out that's exactly the beauty of the whole thing, that each mode can autopoetically, self-reproductively somehow flourish on its own. And then it doesn't need to, and it's actually not even the point, to win over the others or to be somehow absorbed into the others.
Thank you for that. I don't know too much about the systems theory of Niklas Luhmann. Actually, I was first acquainted with it through your channel, and I'm still exploring his thought. And in your channel, Carefree Wandering, there are some videos about it, and it seems quite interesting, which I have to explore more in depth. But thank you for
actually also about a movie. I was kind of disappointed. I'm bring it up in this analysis. My only video about a movie, about this recent movie,
Don't Look Up.
Don't Look Up. Yes. Yeah. And I looked at it. I don't think it's a very good movie, but
Me neither.
nothing compared with Tarkovsky. It's kind of
definitely.
But it somehow applies systems theory without knowing. Yes.
Yes. For the viewers listening to this conversation, go ahead and give a look to Professor Moeller's YouTube channel, Carefree Wandering. It's got very interesting content, like I said at the beginning. Professor Moeller, thank you very much for this conversation. It was an absolute pleasure. And I think you gave some very, very, very engaging insights into Tarkovsky, into Stalker. Tarkovsky is starting to get known very broadly. For a very long time, he was somewhat of a kind of an exotic director, a bit unknown. And in my own YouTube channel, I try to make Tarkovsky a bit more available to people who seek to perhaps get a closer personal relationship with his films, try to understand the ideas and the meaning in his films. And I think that Tarkovsky has made a very deep impact on filmmaking. So to have this interpretation from a professor of philosophy, given that his films have a very rich philosophical substrate, I think it's invaluable. I know some people have talked about Tarkovsky. For example, Slavoj Žižek has talked about Tarkovsky in the past, perhaps some other people. But given your expertise with theology, philosophy, and particularly Eastern philosophy, Taoism, I think that you gave some very, very good, very insightful comments on the film and help build some of the multiple layers that the film has. So I want to thank you very much for this conversation and for allocating the time to talk with me over here.
Thank you, Pedro. It was a pleasure.